Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Read Well podcast. I'm incredibly excited and honored today to have Junot Diaz on the show. Junot is a Pulitzer Prize winner and has won several awards for his work, but he also is just a really strong sort of voice in the literary community and helping us be better readers. And so I'm hoping today that we can talk about the art of reading well and what it means to write great stories and literature and the importance of it today. And so I'd like to introduce you all to Junot Diaz. How you doing, sir?
Oh, pleasure. Thank you, Eddie, so much for having me.
Yeah. I made the comment before we got started. It looks like you're in a tropical location, but you're not really in a tropical location.
No, man, I'm up here in New England. I'm in the Boston area. So
Yeah, that's good. So are you still teaching at MIT?
I am. I'm still teaching at MIT. I'm actually on sabbatical this year, which has been a relief. I mean, it's like such an enormous privilege to get any time off from work, but the election years are a very, very good time to be the hell away.
Yeah, for sure. It's and not that this is meant to get political, but the talk about an election year, it's crazy right now. It seems like everything is affected by this. So, but I'm excited for you. I love going to Boston. I go there every year myself for work, and it's a beautiful place. So, what's it like? I'm just curious. What's it like teaching writing at MIT? MIT is just this incredible school. But what's that been like for you?
MIT is a small school. It's actually very small. It's only like a quarter the size of a place like Harvard. Mm-hmm. But of course, like a place, like a lot of these select colleges, these are fantastically talented young people. You don't get into a place like MIT because you suck at much. I think that I got into college and my I suck at was a list quite long. That they don't have that. And so many of them are already talented artists in their own right. A lot of them do music. A lot of them do dance. Certainly right. A lot of them read and write. And so that what you're left with is that it's like, it's for me, it's a lot of fun because, these are young people that tend to do the work and tend to bring a lot to it. On the other hand, it's also very familiar to me because living in a kind of a culture like in a society like the United States that doesn't value the arts at all, kind of really prepared me for teaching at a place like MIT where my students might love the classes and might love the work, but the pressure for them is to be immensely practical. They're kind of a condensation, of everything that you learn in the outside world becomes just intensely, extracted in a place like MIT. Be practical, make money. And, those of us who are artists, we gotta, it's a fight to get folks to be convinced that what we do matter. And I like that fight. I really do.
Well, let's start that fight because that's the whole reason for my podcast as well, that literature matters and books matter. So, when you think of MIT, you don't usually think of literature. You think of engineers and people doing math and all sorts of other things. So I love that you're there doing that. And so let's talk about that. Why does art matter? Why does literature matter? Because it seems to be changing. The landscape is changing in terms of reading and books and bookstores and all of that stuff. But why take the time to read literature and write it?
No question. I mean, I think that there's enormous changes. I think that there are more changes that, than perhaps folks are giving credit for. I think that there's, it's one of those things where it looks, and I know this is kind of bananas, but like it looks healthier even than it is. And a lot of people would argue it's not a very healthy situation now, considering how, publishers have really publishers in some ways, you've seen them all sort of combining and, merging and all sorts of problems. And also just how little time folks have to be in a contemplative and deliberative process. I mean, to read is to enter into a kind of state of not just mind, but kind of a state of life that is very unlike, that cuts against the sort of velocity that we're being pitched at. And I think that it's interesting because I find reading more closely aligns with what is kind of our normative nervous system, but also more aligns to a lot of our kind of our values. There's nothing about the speed of this culture, for example, the rapidity, the constant reactivity that this culture brings onto people, which is helpful for collaboration, which is helpful for solidarity, which is helpful for justice. Very, very simple, but just priceless kind of practices that we're going to need, and that we currently need to survive and to be fully human in a way that involves flourishing. And so in one sense, it's a place to practice, I think, what are very, very important habits of self, right? What I would call the slow zone of being, which is the only zone we really function well in. We don't function well in kind of a Twitter/Instagram algorithm reactivity. The other thing, of course, is that I think, there's no question, you must have heard this a million times, but there's something about the way that reading hacks across the human brain. Reading has a way of engaging parts of the human brain in a symphony, bringing it all together in this very, very productive cascade, which comes as close as we ever come to any type of, what Doris Lessing and Shikasta called a sense of we feeling, that there is more than just an I, that there exists other people. And I think that this is of profound importance. We're trapped in these skulls of ours. We so long to connect. It's all we really have at the deepest level, from birth to death. We just have this deep, deep drive to connect. And reading, in some ways, most perfectly grants us the opportunity, the glimpses of what that connection might look like, what it might be to connect at a deep, fundamental level with ourselves and with other people.
Well, that's it, everybody. Show's over. That was a really good answer.
I don't know about that.
Well, no, I like I like the concept of velocity. I feel overwhelmed myself. I mean, I own a couple different businesses. I got 4 kids, and it feels like there's never time to slow down. And you add on to that social media and other things. I think we're trained to go faster than we're comfortable with doing. And I think I like how you pointed out that we're all sort of yearning for a connection, but also a connection with ourselves. I was having a discussion last night with some friends, and we were talking about, the Socratic idea of a life unexamined is a life not worth living, right? And very few of us are taking the time to even know who we are, to sit down and write out what I want, who am I, what do I love, what do I hate. We can't say that about ourselves anymore. We're so busy.
And it shows in every facet of our society.
Yeah. Being a writer has got to be all of that times 10, right? And you've mentioned yourself when you write that you tend to be a slower writer. What's it like writing a book? Are you really having to force yourself to come way down and spend time with the work? I mean, what's the day-to-day there?
Yeah. I mean, I also think we got to keep in mind that a lot of what we call writing came out of what we currently accept as like, here's our literature, also came out of industrial processes. It's no accident that many writers write at an industrial scale. You get a book every year from some people, and you get a book every 2 years from some people. And so, which is absolutely fine. And believe me, I wish I could do that. I'd probably have better shoes. But I think that what matters is that while we understand that, and we also understand that that writing can be an opportunity for other kinds of writers, the same way a book is an opportunity for many, many, many kinds of readers. And one kind of writer, which I'm emblematic of, is somebody who definitely takes a long time to work. And I think whether you work short or you work fast, I think there's a lot of having to get down, excuse me, whether you work short or you work long, fast or slow, you've got to get in there. You've got to sort of leave the world behind in a way. Otherwise, you can't, in some ways, create this illusion of life inside the work. And yeah, that has been very strange. But even that's been very strange in this world where being disconnected for a few hours these days is like almost like you've suffered a blackout. Like some calamity has occurred. But even given our jobs, so many of my writer friends talk about how they just can't focus and that they don't go 5 minutes without checking their phone, or, that in some ways their nervous system has been trained by the algorithm. And that's even affected those of us who do this kind of deep work.
Yeah. I just got back from a trip in Hawaii with my family, and I spent a lot of time reading. I take books with me everywhere I go, but I decided not to take books on that trip because for a couple of days, I just wanted to focus on kids and experience and everything. And when I came home, I found that it was really hard for me to get back into the habit of reading. Even just a couple of days away from it, my brain had slipped back into a faster velocity. And even now, when I sit down to read a book, it takes me maybe 10 or 15 minutes to slide into that speed and to accept that I'm going to be slower for a minute. Well, and there's a book too by an author named Marianne Wolf. It's called Reader Come Home, and she talks about how our brains are really not designed to handle this reading thing, and we've had to build new connections and synapses and all sorts of things to be able to process words. And so we're having to train our brain and expand our brain to do this skill well. But once you do it, you open up all sorts of connections and relations and stuff. I mean, what's your experience with that? Do you feel that way when you sit down to read, or is that just me being crazy? Or
no, I mean, I think all of us, especially when you've got such a kind of immense, limbic load. When one has 4 children and a partner, that's an enormous amount of work that goes into just your, the feelingness of life. I don't think it's a surprise that one would come back from such a pause and suddenly stumble over kind of regaining or just reasserting the pattern. But I think it's like anything, we exercise. All complex tasks require us to keep doing them, otherwise they erode. And literacy is no accident. I mean, go a couple months without speaking and then come back to the world and try to be glib. It's just not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
I think that's why literacy for so long was such an important part of, democracy, of education, of identities, because of the way that it permitted these spaces for contemplation, for deliberation, these spaces for, reflexivity. And we've got to work at it. But, it's the same thing with everything. We should be doing a lot more exercise than we're doing. And that's so, it's all of us have been behind. It's nothing to be ashamed of. We just come back at it and, we do it. We try again. I think my whole thing around reading has always been to feel as little shame as I can about it. This is a world that is just constantly sells us on being ashamed, and it's constantly selling us on being ashamed so it can sell us on something. And I just refuse to get into that dialectic with reading. I refuse to be ashamed about it. I refuse to feel bad about whether I've done X amount or Y amount. Sure, I want to encourage myself to do more, but I don't want to get into that economy, man. Because I don't want it linked to anything that's a disappointment, anything that's sort of a bad, kind of just a bad vibe.
Do you, so what's your take on then this sort of hustle culture that is sort of permeated in everything and has found its way into reading? I mean, if I go onto YouTube, for example, every video I see is somebody encouraging you to read 200 books this year, and here's how you read 7 books a week, and on and on and on. How do you feel about that hustle culture?
I mean, I think the thing to do is that, first of all, the delivery system is, the medium is the message. Are we surprised that a reactive, acquisitive, competitive, hierarchical delivery system is selling us a message that is competitive, hierarchical, and atomizing. None of that is about creating community. It's all a pretense, a fiction of creating a community, but it's really just to kind of hammer home that you're this neoliberal identity, and therefore you should, this neoliberal subjectivity, and so therefore you've got to increase productivity. And that's
Yeah.
how one identifies one's values, by increasing productivity. I'm like, really? I don't know. As long as one's reading, one's doing it, and that's it. You don't need to be a freak like me. I'm a freak because I read a lot, and perhaps I flatter myself, but I think I read a lot and I read well. But it's irregardless. I don't care how much I read. I don't value the amount. What I value is that I'm doing it. Nothing else matters. Whether I spent 1 year on a book or 5 fucking hours on a book, it's irrelevant. It's sort of like loving a person. It's like, it's an estar state in Spanish. It's something that it's a praxis. You just do it. And that's that.
I love this. Especially in so we're going to get into culture a little bit, because a lot of what you write is so culturally profound. But here in the American culture, that hustle culture, I have to have goals. I have to sort of be moving ahead at all times. I can't just sit and enjoy. I have to always be advancing, making something of myself. That's bleeding into reading. And so many people are setting reading goals, and if they don't hit them, then they feel that shame. I've never thought about shame as a reader, but you're very right. If people don't read their 50 books a year, they feel like they failed because they only read 48 or something. And what happens if you just read out of the act of reading? You mentioned that you read a lot and that you read well.
It's my fantasy, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a skill, though, right? Getting to that point where you can read a lot and read well takes practice and time. Would you agree with that? Like, how did you get to the point? Yeah.
No question.
How do you get there? How do you do that?
I mean, but it's a lot of it has to do with what one's got going on in their lives. I think that this idea that we're all on this sort of we're all on this plane, and or we're all on this staircase, and that each of us is on the staircase. If I only did X, then I could go 3 steps up and stand right next to you. We're not all on the same fucking staircase. These are all different staircases. And look, I have friends of mine who have freakish minds that can, any kind of game that requires, the kind of logic that makes chess enticing, they're wonderful at. I suck at it. I am not on the same staircase as them. I'm never going to learn enough about logic type games, strategic type games. We're just not on the same staircase. And the idea that we're looking at other people and comparing, and the biggest problem with this bullshit is that it increases one of the, what our wise elders said, one of the worst practices of the self, which is comparison. And, and that's the nature of these sort of digital kind of spaces, is that they're always encouraging competition, comparison. I'm like, look, me, how I did it. Well, first of all, I happen to have a freakish propensity for it. Cool. Second, of the freakish propensity, for whatever reasons, billions of different little decisions, I have a life, and for a lot of that is luck, where there's space for a lot of reading. Now, there's some suffering in there too. Look, not having children for me creates more space for reading, but one also has to suffer what one doesn't have, And so there's that as well. And then, have I trained myself in a kind of athletic way? Do I have it? Is it easy for me to push myself around reading the way it isn't, say, to push myself around basketball? Yes, I agree. So again, I think that human beings are always, there's always a couple of conditions which are very helpful for us. If we make time and we're intentional, shit tends to get done. You know, you make an hour of time and you say, in this hour, I'm just going to read and be easy on myself. And so that it's not tied to some hierarchical competitive like task, chances are it might evolve into something that comes more natural.
Yeah. I love
But,
it.
that's not everybody. I think there's a lot of people have lives where to read is to struggle. And that's okay too. I exercise, and exercise for me is a struggle. It's not this joyful, happens all the time, but for me, it's still a non-negotiable. And I think you can have things that you do in your life that are non-negotiable that require what I would call non-native effort. And for me, exercise requires non-native effort, my brother. I have to really bend my will to it. With reading, I don't got to bend my will much to it.
Yeah.
But neither of these is negotiable. I've got to do both.
This is good. Well, so we're not all on the same ladder. Let's talk about that. There's this term that you've used called otherness. I think this is why I like Oscar Wilde so much. I am an only child. And so I come from a really interesting background where I don't always fit in everywhere I go because I'm not as sociable as other people. I'd rather just be by myself. You come from a sort of self-described nerdy background with all of the stuff that you love as well. Can you talk to me about what otherness means?
Yeah. I mean, otherness, of course, there's the individual experience. There's the sort of sociopolitical, the ways that our societies use otherness to punish, to discipline, to organize, right? And all of these, of course, connect, right? So, for example, that there's entire communities that get othered. Just at a simple, it's a simple way of understanding is that immigrants are almost always universally othered in all societies, and especially in societies that require immigrants in ways that they don't want to recognize or value. The United States requires immigrants. It can't thrive without immigrants, but we're fucked up because we don't want to acknowledge it. And we don't really want to be like, you know what? I appreciate the fact that we have immigrants. I appreciate the fact that this is a country that if without our immigrants, we would fall to pieces. I have gratitude and I've got some humility around that. Well, usually human beings being what they are, otherness tends not to, the way we are, it tends to produce conditions that allow these kind of violences like othering. And so for me, in many ways, I was othered by societal forces, by hegemonic forces, by ideological forces. But in other ways, I wasn't. We tend to be this kind of enlacement of, we're at the center and we're at the margins. And, for example, being male in a patriarchal, being heteronormatively, at least raised heteronormatively male in a heteronormative society, a society that encouraged heteronormativity, it certainly was like a big old plus, man. In other ways, being an immigrant, being a person of African descent, growing up my whole life till I was in my mid-20s poor, that stuff is very othering. Now, the issue, of course, is always that societies expend a lot of effort to create these categories, efforts that distort the person on the receiving end and the people on the beneficial end, and what do we do with that? For me personally, I think that, society, few and rare is the person that society doesn't want to put a foot straight in their mouth, doesn't want to kick them straight in the teeth. That rare is the person. Now, if we compare, there's always communities that get less kick teeth than us, and there's plenty of communities that get worse. The ideas, of course, are always is how do we work against the introjection of these economies into us? How do we unravel? How do we kind of purge ourselves of these sort of terrible kind of patterns? And as a writer, I was always interested in how othering and how one metabolizes othering. I belong to, again, a Dominican, Caribbean immigrant community in central New Jersey. And there was wild ways that the community accepted some of our otherness and attempted to integrate it in kind of really messed up ways, um, in the Dominican Republic, there's this idea of the tigre. It's kind of this, this trickster kind of hustler kind of character. I mean, it's been raised to a virtue. Some of that is good, but some of that is also kind of messed up. And as an
Yeah.
artist, you've got to think about how you're going to be honest to your own sense of otherness, how your privileges helped other people, and how we navigate a society that makes belonging and othering as a kind of an essential dialectic. And I grew up in New Jersey. And when I immigrated to New Jersey, when I was 12 years old, if you had asked me, if you were able to get the language that I would understand in 1983 and 1984 and asked me what was my largest sense of how I felt other, I would probably point to the horizon where there was the New York skyscape. And I would have said, I don't live in New York City. I really want to live in New York City. And I always felt like outside of the flow of things because of that. That's how I understood it at the top of my head. You would have had to push really, really, really hard to get me to finally begin to acknowledge that not being white, being a person of color, being a person of African descent in the 80s, central New Jersey, that was very, very, very corrosive and very hurtful. But that wasn't never at the top of my mind. It was something that I think lived in a subterranean way.
Yeah, there's a lot there. The last interview I did was with an incredible author named Yasmin Muhammad, and she wrote a book called Unveiled. It's her story of being raised in a fundamentally Islamic family and sort of the punishment she went through as a woman and how she lived in Canada and felt very othered. And it's just a really powerful story. And so I think one of the reasons literature is so nice is because it helps us learn about all of these different cultures and people and experiences. Because without stories, we don't always know what's happening out there. We don't understand.
Not at all.
Yeah, we don't understand. I have no idea what it's like to be a Dominican Republican male or to go through your experience or Yasmin's experience. I've lived in Utah my whole life. I'm very sheltered over here. So books have been helpful that way.
I don't think even those of us who live the experience often understand what it means to be it until we see it represented. I mean, that's, I think, what's very interesting. I think the one thing that I share in common with almost everybody on the planet, it wasn't until I began to encounter books that narrativized the African diasporic experience. In some ways, I felt very much aligned to somebody, let's say, in the Arctic circle, because I was as alienated from what that meant as well. So, it's always sort of an interesting thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's take a minute and talk about some of the work that you've put out. So the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is this fascinating book. I had to share this with you. In my book club community, we have, as I've been encouraging people to read it, they are coming back and they're like, oh my gosh, I loved it. I didn't expect to love it. And I loved it. And I have a couple theories on why people are resonating with this book as well as your short stories. But we have one gentleman in particular in our club who's a truck driver. And he said, I hear all of the language and all of the stuff, but even this book made me blush. I thought that was funny because there is a very raw, just sort of honest human sort of voice in here, and it can make you blush. And I wanted to talk to you about that. I've tried to write before, but I feel I have a hard time putting my thoughts or feelings on paper because I'm worried that people will construe what I write, or in a way that they shouldn't or whatever. But you seem to put everything on paper, all of the heart, all of the good, all of the bad. I mean, is that scary for you? Do you ever worry about that?
Nah, it's interesting because it's sort of like something Chip Delaney said about Samuel R. Delaney, the great Samuel R. Delaney writer. If folks haven't read him, you should check out his novel, Dark Reflections. Check out his nonfiction book about Times Square called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. Check out his science fiction, which is kind of monumental. But he said something about, he's often known as having a lot of sex in his books, and yet when he kind of circles where in his books, and this Chip's the kind of guy who would do this, go through his book and circle it, there's almost very little sex. Now, clearly there are books of his where there's a ton of it. But I think his point being made is that often we're known more for the effect of what we're doing than how much is present. And I think one of the things that happens with me in my writing is that I kind of very early on realized that the only honesty that seems to really, for me, that seems to matter is honesty that implicates yourself. You'll always hear people say, "Oh, I'm a real honest person." Usually what they mean is that they're very aggressive. Because honesty unasked for is not honesty, it's aggression. At least in an interpersonal context, certainly not in a justice sort of activist context. But, and I think that it's the same thing. For a narrator to be honest in a book, they have to earn it. And they earn it by being honest with themselves, by being honest with the world, and by being the sort of person who you feel that the honesty isn't another ploy to get likes or to get applause. I think part of the reason, if the honesty in my books functions at all, is that there seems to be no desire in the book for applause or for, wow, this dude is cool, or wow, my God. There's what's left is simply what it might sound like inside of one's head when we're talking to ourselves without the fear that someone's going to punish us, or that the temptation that someone's going to reward us, that distorts what we want to say. Yeah. If the books seem even remotely honest, is because I'm trying to capture what it might seem to eavesdrop on someone putting down their need for approval and putting down their, sort of anger, or just what does honesty sound like inside a person when it has no need.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm very interested in. As for me, certainly I'm like everyone else, man. I'm like, who the hell? We all have our pride. We all have our desires to be approved of. We all would rather say the things that will get us applause. But, I think in fiction, it gives me the opportunity to be a better version of myself in this one area, not across the whole fiction, clearly, because I'm not writing hagiography. I'm not trying to create a saint-like version of myself, even through a fictionalized lens. But certainly in this area, it allows me to be honest in ways that help versus to be honest in ways that serve just another consumptive function, another consumer function.
Yeah. Is it hard to write like that? Is it, I mean, we talked earlier about, I mean, what makes it challenging?
I think because I want approval like everybody else. I want to seem cool. I want to seem like a badass. All of us want all of this like fucking reptile brain shit. And then we go too far. It takes a lot of restraint to be honest in a way that isn't about a bunch of other shit. And it's hard. It's hard just from an interpersonal, then it's hard intrapersonal. It's also just hard to kind of to do it as a craft perspective. There's a bunch of shit that goes into it. And then for me, I find it hard just personally. I am not good at this very thing that someone says they liked. And therefore it takes me an enormous amount of time. That's the wild shit. The shit that takes me forever to do as a writer tends to be the shit that people like, which always kills me because I'm like, wow, I suck at this, which is why I have to work so hard at it. I wish people liked the stuff that I found easy, but that's not the case.
Well, I think there's definitely a different feel when you read authors who are trying to, and this isn't to sort of fill you with accolades, but I mean, there's a reason why the books are winning awards compared to sort of the current beach read or the current sort of, whatever, is when you open a specific piece of literature, you can see some of yourself in that work. I can't really see myself in the current murder mystery beach read, right? But when you open Oscar Wilde and you listen to Junior speak, Junior is a large part of the narration here. There are moments of just complete, I don't know what I'm doingness, right? And I feel that as a person sometimes. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it all depends on where we're at with it, right? Because listen, I'm always surprised of how I can find myself in a book. So I'm kind of more promiscuous around reading. I can find I'm a bit of a whorishness seems to run through me in this aspect where when it comes to books. And I just think that what is so amazing about books cuts against the grain of everything that's human in this current societal moment, right? What's great about books is that they're just not for everybody. That's the nature of a book. The nature of a book is that it is not universal. And that's awesome. We are not claiming to be the Quran. We are not claiming to be for everyone.
Right.
And I think often people forget because the push, of course, is to have as many readers as humanly possible to argue for the more universal elements of literature and all this stuff. And I understand that. I think that that's very, very valuable. And certainly for some people, it's absolutely essential, being better known, being famous, having more books. But the joy of a book is that at the moment that you're reading it, it is working for you. It is irrelevant whether it worked for 1 million people. You could perhaps keep that in mind, but the magic of it is that it's working for you and it is not currently claiming anything else. And that's really dope, man. And that if a book doesn't work for you, that there's another one that might. Because it would be hell if there was only one book. The best part about books is that there's so many. If a book doesn't work for you, well, there's another. And I love that. I love that because you have to search. It's the same way with love. Books reflect it. And the same way with community. You don't just stumble upon your community. Most of us don't, at least. You've got to search, man. You've got to search. And that's what it means to be a human being, and certainly what it means to be a reader. You gotta kiss a lot of frogs to find a book you like.
Yeah, you got to push back a little bit too, right? I mean, even when you're finding your community, you have to push back and sort of get good at asking for things that you care about and want. And you got to do the same in a book. It's okay to ask, to write in the margins of a book and to ask the author questions and to think about it. And we have a film
and ask yourself.
Yeah.
I think right in the margins of yourself. I mean, I often find that, I often remind myself that I'm not just writing in the margins of the book. I got to write in my margins because I've got to demand. If I'm demanding X of this book, the question is why am I not demanding Y of me?
Yeah.
It's like I don't want to always be outward directed, which is that it's always this culture is encouraging us always to be that way.
Yeah, it's good. You've got a lot of short stories that you've written. I wonder if you could talk to us about why you write short stories and what the purpose of a short story is.
I think there's something about the very nature of the short story is that it embodies in itself its own mortality. In other words, the short story is over as soon as you start reading the first word. Where a novel can create an illusion of continuity, a novel can create an illusion that, life doesn't just pass, opportunities don't just go sailing around us, that everything is just ultimately, just very, very kind of transient. And I think short stories are very, very transient. They engage us and then they immediately disappear. They move away. And so they're able to evoke in us what that's like. And this is not even from just forget the form, forget which stories, which writers, though of course we're talking about the form, but I just mean that, like, forget the genre, right?
Mhm.
That there's really this literature that is miniaturized, that is incredibly condensed, dense, but that
Mhm.
ultimately does not linger. It reminds us of how brief everything is.
Mhm.
Oof, what a great form. Again, not everyone likes it. Not everybody
Mhm.
wants that. I think that the comfort and the consolation of a novel, and the consolation novel, is that you can keep flipping to the pages at the end and you know exactly how much you have left, which is
Mhm.
not the case. Short stories tend to be over in one sitting. You're rarely living with them for multiple days with the comfort of
Mhm.
knowing, oh, I've still got 800 pages. I've got 300 pages. And so,
Mhm.
they're kind of a good, in some ways, they're a good, mirror of what it means to be us.
Yeah.
Things
Is it?
just
Is it?
things just sail past.
Yeah,
Things are
man.
fleeting.
Is it harder to write a short story or a novel?
I think it depends on who you are. I mean, for me, I find everything difficult. I think short stories are easier for me. There's some novelists who've never written a short stories because
Mhm.
either they're not interested or they find the form kind of flummoxing. You
Yeah.
know, I think that
Yeah.
it all depends. I think, and it just requires these different energies. For me, I'm not speaking about for anyone else. For me, the novel is integrative. Right? It tries. It's like I've always said this. The novel is like a fire. It tries to integrate everything into it.
Mm.
A novel. Not, is that every novel? No. Is that everyone's novel? No. I'm talking about my own home brew. For me, I just got to be in the spirit to be fire-like, wants to integrate everything, versus the short story, where the short story is highly exclusionary. I'm
Mm.
always looking to cut things, to eliminate, to lock things out.
Yeah.
I don't. It depends on what mode I'm in. I find I'm drawn to different kinds of work, and you could
You just
start
made a
one
really,
way and end up another.
yeah, for sure. You just made a really great reference about fire integrating everything into it. That has reference to a book called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, who's a Stoic philosopher.
Of course, I
Some
know it well.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that's fun. And he talks about in that book that we need to decide to be intelligent as well. In any interaction we have, whether we're reading a book, we're talking to somebody, we need to decide to turn our brain on and to slow down and pay attention to what really matters. And when we do that, we start to integrate all of the important things. And like fire, it starts to grow, right? But
Yeah.
if we don't make that decision to get intelligent, if we just get on the hamster wheel and run, then we miss all of the important things. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful concept.
Yeah, no, I think so. It's like, and I always think about that reactive intelligence versus what
Mm-hmm.
he's arguing for, which is a more responsive intelligence. I do think that there's no question what you're saying is that I'm not sure I'm actually intelligent when I'm bringing to
The
bear the tools of intelligence in the service of my reactivity, but is that intelligence? I'm not. I myself am not sure. I don't think so. You know, because they're not being
well,
wielded to that end of intelligence. So yeah.
this is why hindsight will get you every time, right? Because looking back, you're like, oh, I should have done it this way. I should have said this or what have you. Yeah.
No, I live in a perpetual state of I should have done it better.
Yeah. So do I. If we go back to the short story concept for a minute, I love essays. Essays are some of my favorite things to read, and it's kind of a similar experience, right? They come and they
Yeah,
go in
very
one
much
sitting.
so.
Yeah. Do you have any short story authors that you like to read that would be a good recommendation?
Ooh, endlessly. I
Yeah. Who are the
mean,
best?
I think Edward P. Jones is the best. I think
Mm.
Lost in a City, his first collection, is one of the most wondrous collections, bar none. Mary Gates' skills, her short stories are just perfection in themselves. I think Bharati Mukherjee's short stories, I think they're The Middleman and other stories. I think that they're stories that I don't think people give enough kind of they don't pay enough attention to,
Mm-hmm.
but they're just remarkable. Laurie Moore, of course, is one of our titans. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, everybody's got their different bag about, I love this kind of author. I'm like, yo, you can bring your short story writers around. I'm gonna bring Lori Moore around. We'll see who finishes. You know, just to use the competitive frame here, just to show how just her talents are just absolutely endless. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, the autobiographical memoir essay mode, which sort of gets sometimes put into the story. I think that Maxine Hong Kingston, Sandra Cisneros, um, Maxine Hong Kingston for the more autobiographical, Sandra Cisneros for the more kind of in the fiction mode, just remarkable stuff.
You can always tell when you're talking to a reader because they just light up when they start talking about their favorite
Oh yeah.
authors. It's
And,
good stuff.
writers everybody loves. George Saunders is just this.
Oh yeah.
Stories are just incredible, etc. One can keep going.
Yeah. He's actually got a really cool Substack, Saunders does. It's kind of fun to read. Anyway.
George is amazing.
Yeah, for sure. So a couple random questions here. Not random. I mean, if we go back to Oscar Wilde for just a minute, I'm curious. What's your feeling on the Fuku? Is that a real thing? Do you feel like that's something we all struggle with?
I mean, it depends. The Fuku in my book is, for those of us who don't know, for those folks out there, is a kind of a myth of a curse.
Mm-hmm.
Fuku is a curse in the Dominican context. And I mean, sometimes I believe in a curse, sometimes I don't. It depends on what my mood, where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that abstractions like being blessed or being cursed, being lucky, these things, I think they're very attractive to people. Yeah. I think as a nation, the United States is obsessed with them. We believe we're the blessed nation. We believe in our exceptionalism, which of course means that it evokes its immediate opposite. If you believe that there's someone who's blessed or is exceptional, then you believe curses exist as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it depends on my mood and where I'm at. I do think that they've served as a helpful way to, at least from the point of view of a writer, as a helpful way to bond individuals to larger historical patterns, same way the Greeks did it. The Greeks could take these larger kind of God movements and bond them down to the individual through curses and through blessings. So as a writer, I was very interested in that.
Mm. Yeah, I love it. That sort of leaning into myth and belief to sort of craft your story seems to be really important. What about just overall bigger tools like magical realism and those kinds of things? Some of that shows up a little bit in Oscar Wilde with the mongoose and a few other things. What's your take on magical realism?
I mean, it's just a strategy. Sometimes it's understood just more as something, as also as a kind of a overly big umbrella, which certain writers are thrown underneath. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just think that, I just think ultimately realism is not the only mode. Realism is not the only strategy. Clearly, there's entire genres that are in open defiance of realism. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we call magical realism, sort of the same way that we call a whole bunch of different approaches, they're just ways to get around the limitations of realism. Yeah. I think that the more extreme the world you're trying to describe, the more extreme the reality you're trying to transmit onto fiction, the more likely you're going to figure out ways to short and to hack the kind of the awkwardness, the cumbersomeness of realism. I just think realism doesn't do a great job in capturing, for example, the immigrant experience and capturing the African diasporic experience. Realism doesn't even do a good job of capturing America. I mean, America, this kind of massive construct, it exceeds realism. It's just so wild and nutty that you've got to sometimes, switch to fantasy and science fiction to begin to get your fingers around the edges of it.
That leads into a paper written by a gentleman named David Bautista. I think he talks about your work and says that less magical realism, more something he calls comic book realism. I don't know if you've come across that paper, but
I haven't.
Yeah, he created a new term for you, comic book realism. And it's the idea of leaning on all of this sort of pop culture to help us make sense of our reality, especially when we're not feeling like we're fitting in. And that ability to look towards superheroes and things of mythical creation or science fiction or fantasy to help us get through the hard parts of life seem to be important for people like Oscar. I mean, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, again, I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but I definitely think Oscar and Junior both used their popular culture as a way to assemble lenses that allowed them to both understand the world and to be in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not uncommon. Most of us,
Yeah.
we tend to create armatures around ourselves, so that this world isn't so incredibly unbearable. I also think that, when it comes to literature, it's important that literature is complicated enough for people to make arguments that, like this one, arguments that can persuade enough people, because that's ultimately what matters, is that you want there to be space in your work for people to assemble what is more or less ways of thinking about the book. I like that,
Yeah.
I less have to agree than more that I just enjoy the fact of its existence.
Mm. Yeah, using those ideas to create a lens, like you mentioned. And let's talk about us for a minute here. Is there anything you're nerding out about these days? Like, what's got your nerd attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely never stop nerding when it comes to, you know, um, sort of narrative. It's
Mm-hmm.
summer, so I'm taking it easy. As always, I do my rereadings. I'm always rereading books. I just can't help it. It's my nature. So, I've been rereading a couple of books, um, and it's been fun. For example, I've been reading Mario Vargas Llosa's Aunt Julia and the Screenwriter and the Scriptwriter. I just halfway through that. I've been reading Stephen King's Salem's Lot, and currently reading Riley Sager. I don't know, never know how to pronounce the name. Sager, their latest, The Only One Left. And also I've been on a horror kick. And Josh, I don't know, remember Josh Mallerman? He did Bird Box. He's got a new novel called Incidents Around the House. And as far as those are the books that got me most kind of grabbed right now. But it's a quiet summer. We'll see what picks up once I get back on campus to the library.
Yeah, I just finished. I don't know if you've ever read Flowers for Algernon.
Daniel Keyes, one of my favorites.
Yeah, that book just knocked me out. It was so good.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book.
Yeah, it is. It's a really good book. I love books like that have. I love all books, but if it has sort of an underlying meaning about just human nature, it just really gets a hold of me. And that book does such a good job at helping you to explore what it means to be human and what it means to try and accept yourself and try to, I don't know, the relationship side of everything. It's probably the saddest book I've ever read at the same time. It's just destroyed me. So
yeah, and it did so by deploying non-realism. I mean, that's what's really, really interesting, is that the effects of the strategy of non-realism are real. And so there it is. It imagines someone who can, in a brief period, go from this kind of mental intelligence, this mental condition, to a complete another kind of mental intelligence, mental condition. That's impossible. Or at least it's it's impossible the way this imagines it, the way it dramatizes it. But here we are seeing it in our book, and yet this fantasy, because it's what it is, it's a fantasy, allows us to be in the real in ways that we could not be otherwise. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, it's a great book. It is. It's a great book. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We're at about an hour here. I just had a couple of questions left.
Sure.
I'm just curious. What's that?
We'll do some quick responses.
Yeah, there you go. So for you right now, what are you working on anything these days? Are you pretty much focusing on teaching? Where's your brain at?
No, you know what? I still haven't gotten over a book that collapsed recently, so I haven't been able to get anything started.
Yeah, totally get it. Pretty much focusing on enjoying reading good books and teaching really
Yeah,
interactive kids. Yeah,
yeah,
good
that's
for
what I've been
you.
up to.
Good for you. All right. If somebody were to go to Boston, what's the best thing they should do there if they only had a couple days?
Oh, Boston, that's actually pretty easy. They should go to the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. They should go to the ICA, right? They
Okay.
should go to the Harvard Art Museum, which is completely free, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a great space. It brings you onto Harvard campus, so you can look
Mm-hmm.
around. Um, then they should eat, and because the food is not bad, we're not as good as a kind of equivalent city like Austin or Seattle, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
And Little Donkey and Sakara, um, these are restaurants that are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a Thai place called Mahaniyam. I can't pronounce it, but it's Mahaniyom.
Okay.
Just ridiculously good.
Mm-hmm.
Get yourself some brunch over at Flower or Vervain, and then of course you got to take in the Charles River, man.
Yeah,
Take in
man.
the Charles River if you can. That's You'll take a walk on that park. Take a bike ride.
What's the best small bookshop in Boston?
I mean, there's a lot. There's in Harvard Square. Well, I shouldn't say there's a lot. That's wrong. I would go to Rodney's in Harvard Square.
Rodney's.
Rodney's is just remarkable. There's Trident Books. Is also really kind of fun as hell. Trident Books over on Newberry Street.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I always say if you can get out to the Cape, well, not at the Cape. It's the North Shore. So I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's some good books, a good store, good bookstores in the Cape as well. There's one in Gloucester that I really, really enjoy. You know,
Nice. Nice. And I guess last question here. If you were to be buried in your coffin with just one book, what book would that be? You said you're into horror, so I had to go with the coffin thing,
I don't mind. That doesn't trouble me. The only thing that we know for sure is that we're going to die. So there's not a
That's for
problem with
sure.
that.
Yeah.
You know what? I would be conflicted all the way down to the end between Patrick Chamoise's Texaco and Octavia Butler's um, Dawn and Toni Morrison's Beloved. And
Mm.
I'd probably end up with Toni Morrison. Though
Yeah,
again,
good.
check with me.
Beloved.
Check with me as I'm going into the coffin.
Yeah, good for you. Good stuff. Well, Juno, fantastic opportunity to meet with you today. Thank you so much for talking about literature and kind of keeping that conversation alive and for all that you've done and the work that you're doing.
I appreciate you a lot, man. Good luck out there, and drop me a line if you come to Boston.
Will do. Yeah, I
All right,
absolutely will. I look forward to that.
great.
All
You
right.
take care of yourself, brother.
Thanks, Juno. Take care, everybody. All right. I hope you all enjoyed that interview. Juno is an incredible author. If you haven't read his work yet, I encourage you to do so. The book, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, is fantastic. It will make you blush, like I mentioned. The voice in here can be really strong, but it is an honest voice, and I think that's something that we're lacking in great literature, is to hear our authors speak and think the way that we do sometimes as human beings. Sometimes if you've ever tried to write something yourself, as I mentioned in my interview, you're very tempted to sort of filter things out and to self-criticize and judge so that the final written product is not human. It's not real. It's not honest or truthful. And Juno seems to have a real talent for ignoring some of that and just putting human on paper. He did admit that that is hard for him to do and that he struggles with that. And so it takes him a long time to write books. It took many, many years for him to write this book, but it shows because it's really, the voice is unlike anything you've ever read. So go check out his book, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And until next week, as always, remember to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. I'll see you all next time.